Origin and development. The evolution of the Peace Officer Bill of Rights is inextricably linked to the broader historical currents that shaped American policing and labor relations in the latter half of the 20th century. Its origins and subsequent development reflect a deliberate response to the tensions that arose between public demands for accountability, the growing professionalism of police forces, and the intensifying efforts of law enforcement personnel to secure workplace protections. Understanding the emergence and trajectory of POBR requires an examination of its earliest legislative models, the political and social environment that nurtured its expansion, and the legal frameworks that permitted its entrenchment. Maryland's enactment of a Law Enforcement Officers' Bill of Rights in 1974 is widely regarded as the seminal event in the formation of POBR statutes. Drafted in a period marked by civil unrest, controversies surrounding police misconduct, and the rise of assertive police unions, the LEOBR reflected a conscious effort to codify due process rights for officers under internal investigation. The architects of the LEOBR sought to ensure that law enforcement personnel, often facing accusations amid politically charged and media-driven climates, were guaranteed standardized procedural safeguards. By granting protections such as advance notice of interrogations, the right to representation, and provisions that limited public disclosure of certain evidence, the LEOBR established a blueprint for subsequent legislation. The diffusion of POBR laws to other jurisdictions was neither uniform nor accidental. As police unions and labor organizations grew in strength, often aided by collective bargaining and heightened political influence, they lobbied state legislatures to adopt similar statutes. These unions cited the Maryland experience as evidence that officers required equitable mechanisms to protect them from what they perceived as arbitrary or politically motivated discipline. States such as California soon followed suit, and in doing so, adapted the original Maryland model to their particular legal cultures and enforcement norms. Over time, variations of POBR provisions emerged nationwide, each reflecting local negotiations, judicial interpretations, and prevailing political priorities. The expansion of POBR was also facilitated by the broader professionalization of policing. As departments instituted standardized training, accreditation, and policy reforms, the notion that officers warranted workplace protections comparable to those enjoyed by other public employees gained traction. This environment was conducive to POBR legislation. By granting legally codified rights, reformers argued that morale would improve and recruitment would benefit from assurances of procedural fairness. Nonetheless, the evolution of POBR did not occur without pushback and controversy. Civil rights advocates, legal scholars, and investigative journalists have pointed out that these protective measures, while rooted in legitimate concerns about fairness, can inadvertently hinder transparency and accountability. They argue that provisions restricting public access to disciplinary proceedings and inhibiting the early disclosure of relevant evidence often empower departments to shield problematic conduct from scrutiny. Such criticisms intensified as further states embraced POBR, and as mounting case studies suggested the law's potential role in reducing evidentiary discovery and trials. By the close of the 20th century, POBR's origins and development had coalesced into a complex tapestry. Initially conceived as a counterweight to volatile political pressures and a bulwark against arbitrary discipline, these statutes evolved into an entrenched fixture of American policing. The next chapters of this book will delve deeper into these mechanisms, analyzing their state-by-state variations, exploring how they have reshaped the legal environment, and critically assessing the delicate equilibrium they attempt, and often struggle, to maintain between protecting officers' procedural rights and ensuring the public's faith in law enforcement. Key provisions and protections. The Peace Officer Bill of Rights, POBR, has significantly shaped the procedures and protections afforded to law enforcement officers across numerous jurisdictions. Embedded in these statutes are provisions designed to ensure that any administrative or internal investigation into officer conduct respects standardized procedural safeguards. These safeguards encompass detailed guidelines for how investigations are conducted, what disciplinary actions are permissible and under which circumstances, and the rights officers have to secure representation during potentially career-altering proceedings. As these laws have evolved, legal scholars, policymakers, and advocacy groups have closely examined their practical implications, weighing the purported benefits against concerns about accountability and transparency. Investigation procedures. One of the most defining features of POBR legislation lies in the regulation of internal investigations into alleged officer misconduct. In contrast to earlier, more arbitrary mechanisms of inquiry, POBR frameworks often prescribe precise, step-by-step protocols intended to uphold fairness. These protocols may include advance written notification of pending interviews, strict limitations on the times and locations at which officers can be questioned, and the requirement that questions be recorded or otherwise documented. The aim is to prevent fishing expeditions and to ensure that officers are neither coerced nor subjected to unduly invasive tactics. A key element within these statutes is the assurance that investigations proceed according to a predefined timeline. Many POBR laws limit the length of internal investigations, mandating that departments reach certain milestones or conclude their inquiries within a set period. In theory, this prevents protracted morale-damaging probes that can cast suspicion over an officer's career for months or even years. However, critics argue that strict timelines can discourage thorough, meticulous investigations, potentially enabling misconduct to remain undiscovered or insufficiently examined. Civil rights organizations and community advocates have expressed concern that time constraints may induce cursory reviews, ultimately diminishing public trust in the thoroughness and integrity of the process. Moreover, certain POBR provisions prohibit investigators from using certain interrogation methods that might be seen as coercive, and often forbid the use of polygraph examinations unless other employees face the same test. Such restrictions reflect a desire to avoid an uneven or inherently biased inquiry. Although well-intentioned, this regulatory framework can reduce investigators' flexibility, making it more challenging to gather comprehensive evidence, particularly when cross-referencing multiple accounts of an incident. Disciplinary actions. POBR statutes frequently set forth explicit criteria and processes for imposing disciplinary actions once misconduct has been established or strongly substantiated. Before the POBR era, disciplinary measures could be meted out with limited procedural checks, allowing for potential abuses of power, political pressure, or personal vendettas. By codifying disciplinary procedures, POBR legislation endeavors to treat officers more like employees in other professions, where due process governs workplace sanctions. Disciplinary actions under POBR typically range from reprimands and suspensions to demotion and termination. However, the statutes generally require that such actions follow an established protocol. Officers must be informed of their alleged violations, afforded opportunities to respond, and, in many cases, permitted to appeal decisions to an independent review board or arbitrator. This multi-layered approach was conceived to prevent hasty verdicts and encourage a fair evaluation of the underlying facts. Additionally, appellate mechanisms serve as a safeguard against political exploitation, ensuring that police chiefs or elected officials cannot arbitrarily dismiss officers without sound evidentiary support. Nevertheless, observers have pointed out systemic issues with these disciplinary frameworks. Critics note that the complexity and rigidity of the rules can lead to lengthy, costly, and convoluted procedures. In some instances, arbitrators reinstating officers who had been fired for serious infractions raise questions about the long-term cultural implications of these provisions. Political scientists and labor relations scholars have argued that, while POBR laws protect officers from unjust termination, they can also insulate problem officers who might otherwise be removed from a force, thus eroding public confidence and potentially diminishing overall accountability. Rights to representation. The right to representation is another cornerstone of POBR legislation. Recognizing that internal investigations and disciplinary actions can have severe implications for an officer's career, income, and personal reputation, these laws ensure that officers have the option of counsel or union representation during interrogations and hearings. Representation can take various forms, ranging from legal counsel retained by the officer personally to an attorney or advocate provided by a police union. The representative may guide the officer through the intricacies of POBR procedures, suggest strategic responses, and ensure that no procedural rights are being violated. From the perspective of law enforcement personnel, this guarantee of representation promotes a sense of fairness and security. Facing allegations, especially in high-profile cases that attract intense media attention, can be stressful and disorienting. Having a knowledgeable advocate helps ensure that the accused officer fully understands the implications of questions, the scope of departmental authority, and the significance of any admissions made during the inquiry. The presence of representation, in other words, aims to mitigate perceived power imbalances between the investigator and the officer under scrutiny. Yet, these representational rights have themselves sparked debate. Critics contend that the involvement of union attorneys, in particular, may encourage a more adversarial posture, thus complicating or hindering the investigative process. This legalistic approach can prioritize the protection of the officer's interests over broader organizational or community concerns, potentially limiting transparency and slowing the path toward resolution. As some scholars have suggested, when investigations transform into quasi-judicial hearings, they might elevate procedural formality at the expense of clear fact-finding. The tension between representation rights and the public's desire for thorough, impartial investigations has fueled ongoing debates about the proper balance. Proponents argue that denying officers robust representation would risk returning to an era of arbitrary and unjust employment practices, while opponents caution that overemphasis on procedural minutiae can obscure the core purpose of accountability mechanisms. The result is an uneasy equilibrium in which legitimate protections for officers coexist uneasily with broader demands for transparent, fact-driven disciplinary processes. Contemporary reflections and ongoing debates. Over the decades, the key provisions and protections enshrined in POBR laws have faced increasing scrutiny. As public awareness of police misconduct has grown, often spurred by high-profile incidents and resultant civil unrest, calls for reforms to POBR frameworks have amplified. Reform advocates argue that the complexity and rigidity of POBR provisions too often shield officers from accountability, limit evidentiary discovery, and diminish the deterrent effect of disciplinary measures. They urge that carefully calibrated revisions, such as adjusting timelines, reducing procedural hurdles to evidence disclosure, and balancing representational rights with transparent investigative methods, are necessary to ensure that procedural protections do not become barriers to justice. On the other hand, supporters maintain that POBR provisions are essential safeguards in a context where public opinion and political pressures can rapidly shift against law enforcement. They contend that without these statutory guarantees, officers might be subject to exploitative disciplinary regimes driven by partisan agendas or emotional outbursts rather than fact-based reasoning. From their perspective, POBR protections do not necessarily preclude accountability. Rather, they ensure that accountability measures proceed on a stable and impartial foundation. As this dialogue continues, the tension between the intended purpose of POBR laws and their real-world outcomes remains palpable. The investigation procedures, disciplinary actions, and rights to representation codified in these statutes stand at the heart of the issue. They define the balance between an officer's right to fair treatment and the public's right to trust that misconduct will be addressed transparently and justly. Understanding these foundational provisions is critical to any attempt at reforming, defending, or reimagining the future of POBR legislation and the policing institutions it governs.